So now let's go over anatomical terms. So the reason why I think it's important for you to know this is if you even read a basic news article, they'll be throwing around some of these terms. So just like any other hobby or sport or any other area of specialty, neuroscience has its own language. And so these are some of the terms that you would see when you are reading some kind of news article about the brain. So unfortunately for this particular section of the class, a lot of it's just memorization and probably you should just use your book. But I'll do my best to try to help you out with this. So I copied this chart from your textbook. You can find it there. Um, and so we're going to be going over these terms, and then for the second portion of this we have another chart that's in your textbook. You get started. So what we have here is this is a lateral view of the brain. Lateral means to the outside. So lateral also means away from the midline of the body. So you're looking at the outside portion of the brain. So if I took the brain and flipped it, you'd still be looking at a lateral view. Now, the way that I remember it is I know that in the gym there's exercises to develop your lats. The lats are like the wings on your back, and so you build those up to make your waist look smaller. However, if you never work out in the gym and you don't know anything about your latissimus dorsi muscle, then maybe lateral doesn't work for you. Let's see what medial means. So this is a medial cut. So this one I think that we could relate to the middle. So when you have a sagittal cut, it's basically if you part your hair in your middle, if you cut straight down, that would be a sagittal cut. You're looking at the sagittal plane, looking at the inside midline portion of the brain. So medial means to the inside. It's the opposite of lateral. So you could remember that as kind of medial middle, toward the midline of the body. Okay, let's go to the next one. Now, this is where it kind of gets tricky because even though this is saying it's the anterior portion of the brain, it'd be more like in this area because anterior means your textbook says toward the front. I said toward the head. Um, Posterior means toward the tail. But this is toward the head, but all of these terms were written for four-legged animals. So the way that you really have to think about it is you have to think of the human being on four legs to get the gist of it. So actually the anterior view would be kind of more like this area. And then the posterior, we don't have a tail, but if you can imagine your head, and imagine if you had a tail, if you were sitting on all fours, then this portion would be the posterior portion. It's very hard for me to even remember this. I just have to picture the person on all fours to picture where, like, the anterior portion would be, the posterior portion would be. Okay, now, this is another one that I need one of those, I guess it's the animation, Maya animation maybe, where you can rotate the brains around. So basically this is the front, and so kind of what you're looking at is the underneath portion. So if you could cut off, if you made a slice and just kind of cut up through someone's chin, and so this is where your nose would be, your chin would be right about here. You're looking at the underside of the brain. This would be the back of your head, but this is a ventral view. So ventral means toward the front. So the way that I always remembered it is the Spanish word for window is ventana, and I would remember that the windows would be in the front of the house. However, your textbook has a good way of remembering it, is it says, think of the word ventriloquist. It's actually a stomach talker, because some textbooks actually define ventral as toward the stomach, because remember the animal should be on all fours, and so the front would be kind of toward the stomach. Now, dorsal means toward the back, and the way that I remember dorsal is I know about the dorsal fin on the shark. That's what you always see sticking up out of the water. However, if you don't know about the dorsal fin, I'm not sure. Maybe the door, you're going out the back door, so the windows would be in the front of the house and then the door would be in the back. Maybe you could think of it that way. You'll just have to think of a way to kind of memorize that. Okay, So now the next terms that are on our chart are superior and inferior. So this is actually a picture of the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. So superior means above and inferior means below. I think that a lot of you can just relate to that because there it is. So this is the superior colliculi and this would be the inferior colliculi. And we'll be learning about those a little bit later in class. Okay, so now the next thing that we want to look at is your textbook goes into ipsilateral and contralateral. So ipsilateral means on the same side of the body, whereas contralateral means on the opposite side of the body. But then they talk about the different planes. So we did see a sagittal cut, which showed us a medial view, which is kind of straight down the part. But then a coronal cut would be just like chopping, like if you could chop your face off and then you went to the thing and then straight. So you'd be chop, 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 chop. That's a coronal section. And then the horizontal just makes natural sense. The horizontal cut is sliced across the horizon. So, so then we have the ventral, the dorsal. This is all in your textbook. You can take a look at it. So this is the horizontal plane. So we're going to find out that these are where the ventricles are, these spaces. You've got two lateral ventricles and the third and fourth ventricle. So this is a horizontal plane where you've gone straight across. This is a sagittal plane right here where you've cut down the middle, and this is a coronal plane. So again, here's the ventricles, the spaces in between. This would be a big fissure, which we're going to go over. You've got gray matter and white matter that we're going to be learning about. So these are the different planes, the different views of the brain. We don't usually, in this class, we don't usually work with the horizontal view or the coronal view. We work mostly with a lateral view, which is an outside, and the medial view, which is a sagittal cut. Okay, so here's a little quiz. Take a look at all these brains and see what you remember from our lecture. So what view would this be? This is a lateral view. What view would this be? This would be a horizontal view. What view would this be? That would be a medial view. And what view would this be? A coronal view. So hopefully you got those correct. Okay, now we're at the last section of the terminology part. And again, I'm really sorry, but I think there's just no other way. You're just going to have to try to memorize them. You don't see the terms laminae and columns so much, so I'm not going to put as much emphasis, but I do think you should know the difference between a tract and a nerve. So what you're going to find out is that we have fibers in our nervous system called axons. So when you have some fiber, it's not really correct to say the nerves in your brain, because nerves are only in the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. But when you have a bundle of axons in the central nervous system through the brain or the spinal cord, then it's a tract. So tracts are a bundle of axons in the central nervous system, and a nerve is a bundle of axons within the peripheral nervous system. And then what you have is you have cell bodies, and so if you have a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system, then you call it a nucleus. So when they say the preoptic nucleus, basically what they're saying is they're saying the cluster of cell bodies that's above the optic chiasm or the optic nerve, or it's near the optic nerve. If you say the suprachiasmatic nucleus, then it's a bundle of cell bodies above the optic chiasm. It's superior to the optic chiasm. So you call a cluster of cell bodies in the CNS a nucleus, but you call a cluster of cell bodies in the PNS, peripheral nervous system, a ganglion. So ganglions and nerves are in peripheral nervous system, and a nucleus and a tract are in the central nervous system. Again, this is in your textbook, and I think you should just try to figure out a way to try to remember it. The gyrus is like a bump on the brain. So the way that I remember that is when you gyrate your body, then you're kind of bumping your body. You're bumping and grinding, right? Gyrus, it's a bump on the brain. A sulcus is sunken in. Could you remember that? Sulcus, sunken in. It's a fold in the brain. So basically the outside cortex of your brain, which cortex I guess means bark, and you can see how it would be like the bark of the brain. The bumps would be the gyri, we call it gyri as plural, and the sunken in part, the wrinkles, are the sulci. Then what you have is when you have a really, really deep sulci, they call it a fissure. So I think I have some pictures here. Let me just show you what this is. Okay, so this is a really, really deep sulcus here. So they call it the lateral sulcus, but sometimes they'll call it the lateral fissure because it's so deep. Then these here, these are bumps on the brain, and as you can see, you have the hippocampal gyrus, you have the fusiform gyrus, the lingual gyrus, and then this is where you have some fissures. Basically what separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe are fissures. And that's what separates this is the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe, and that's a big fissure. So when you have a deep sunken in wrinkle, it's called a fissure, but sometimes they call it a sulcus. And when you have a big bump there, or a bump, it's called a gyrus. Okay, so this concludes the vocabulary portion of. So let's just review the terms that we went over. We went over lateral, which is to the side. We went over medial, which is towards the midline. We went over superior, which is above. We went over inferior, which is below. We went over ventral, which is toward the front. We went over dorsal, which is toward the back. We went over anterior toward the head and posterior toward the tail. Then what we did is we showed you the different planes that you can look at the brain. We looked at a sagittal plane, which is a cut straight through the head. Then we went over a coronal plane, which is slicing like through the front of the face. And then a horizontal plane would be a slice on the horizontal, on the horizon. So we went over that, and then we went over some different terms like the difference between a nerve and a tract. A nerve is in the peripheral nervous system, whereas a bundle of axons in the central nervous system is called a tract. We saw what the wrinkles of the brain are called, a sulci and gyri, and we talked about fissures. So basically there's, I'm going to estimate there's probably about 15 or 16 different terms that you have to know, and you should probably just take a look in your textbook and kind of memorize those charts.